Wisconsin is split with a Republican presidential-elect and a Democratic senator winning the state.
If Republican President-elect Trump wins Arizona and Democrat Ruben Gallego becomes our next senator.
So look at North Carolina where Trump won, but the Democrats held on to the governor's mansion, right? Clearly, people were splitting votes.
One of the most surprising outcomes of the 2024 U.S. election was that there was a rise in voters who split their ticket, meaning they cast their down-ballot votes for Democrats, but checked the box for Trump at the top. One district where this happened was New York's 14th, the home of U.S. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, AOC.
I would really love to hear from you. This is not a place of judgment.
The result was surprising not just to voters, but to the Congresswoman herself, who took to social media to ask her followers why.
I actually want to learn from you.
She said that the answers kind of blew her mind.
Y'all, this is why I say that we should be signing up to knock on doors and be on the phones, because the internet and mass media, which, by the way, at this point, all of these apps, Instagram, X, like Twitter, whatever, it's mass media too, because they've all been bought up by billionaires the same way a lot of these television channels have. Anyways, if you're only tuning in to those mediums, you will think that most people fall along this spectrum. And a lot of people don't.
As it turns out, there was a common thread, something that unites folks who love AOC and also folks who love Trump.
When it comes to people who split their ticket, I think a lot of people cited several different things. One is there is universal frustration in this country. Much of it, I actually think, justified. That is raging at a political establishment that centers corporate interests, billionaires, and puts their needs ahead of the needs of working Americans.
As human beings, we love to categorize and organize the world around us. It is literally part of our nature.
Why do women vote for Trump? I have no idea.
Martha, we don't know.
He still received a big share of the Latino vote. I'm curious about why you think that is.
Why vote for Elon Musk and Donald Trump?
We like for things to fit in a neat box. We do this when we vote, and we also do it when we assess potential threats. The problem is that in most cases, it's wrong. Not everyone fits in a box, and when we do things like, say, refer to U.S. militias as white nationalist, which personally I've been doing casually for a few years now, and I'm not the only one, that's also wrong. Today on Things That Go Boom, we talk to expert Amy Cooter about the U.S. militia movement. We learn what it is, what it isn't, and once we've got that straight, what we can do about it.
Hey, it's Luke Burbank, host of the new podcast, Damp January, where every Wednesday in January, I'll be talking to someone about what their deal is with drinking, like the author Gary Steingart, who says, honestly, living a long life is overrated. So why not have another one?
And there's all these doctors telling us that 0 is the best number of drinks to have. But I mean, we're all worked so hard. Neoliberalism really just whips us every day.
Things are going to get damp this January, and everyone's invited. Check out Damp January from Livewire, wherever you get your podcasts.
My 1-year-old got up at 3:30 and has been up ever since. So I'm a little like, I've already had too much coffee today, but it's good. It's good. So.
Oh, gosh.
Let me try the book line again and then we'll go.
That's Amy Cooter. She's the research director at the Accelerationism Research Consortium.
You can check out my book, Nostalgia, Nationalism, and the U.S. Militia Movement, which was out in February with Routledge.
She's also a fellow mom and researcher from rural America.
I'm a Nashville transplant like so many people are, but I think I get partial credit at least being a native Tennessean.
Amy's been studying the U.S. militia movement since about 2008, when, as a grad student in Michigan, she attended a public meeting of a group that was thought to be, essentially, a cover for a more underground neo-Nazi movement.
That was common wisdom, that militia groups and some others in that world were working as a direct funnel to these more extreme, overtly racist groups.
When she made it to this meeting, though, it became clear almost immediately that this was not the case. In fact, some neo-Nazi forums were actually trash-talking these types of militias online. And the guys she encountered, well, they were a lot less skinhead and a lot more the kind of folks she might know back home.
I recognized pretty quickly how much kind of basic Americana these guys embodied and represented, and how the feelings they had, the ideas that they had, really were resonating much more broadly than people recognized.
She realized that this militia movement that she encountered, it was worthy of study all on its own. But most academics weren't studying it, partly because they believed that all these guys were the same, and they're not.
So traditionally, we've had what we call constitutionalist militias, which fairly closely matched the image they try to put forth of grown-up Boy Scouts. They hang out together, they go to the woods, they shoot, they practice, they talk about, what masculinity means to them in interesting ways. And most of the time, we don't really have to worry about them in terms of some sort of external threat of violence.
The other group are called millenarians. And there's a long history in that name that's rooted in the second coming of Christ. But these groups also had something of a reemergence around the turn of the millennium.
They're the ones who almost always end up on the news. They're a much more stereotypical version, much more conspiratorial, much more hierarchically oriented in a way that leads to a lot of groupthink, much more likely to be engaged in violence or plots of violence at the very least.
We so often are talking about these groups as, we use white nationalist movement for domestic extremism generally. Is that accurate?
It's not accurate, and I actually argue that it's a problem that we do that. Many of these groups don't think about themselves as being racist or having any racial animosity whatsoever. And we really need to take that into consideration, in my opinion, because if we're talking about overt neo-Nazis who are openly advocating for ideas of white power and white supremacy and openly advocating for direct harm against other racial groups, that's a very different starting conversation than somebody who believes that everybody is equal, but may not understand that in practice we're not actually there yet. They don't understand systematic or institutional racism or some of the other problems that we continue to have.
Grouping everyone into the same extremist category can actually make it harder to address systemic racism.
It makes us discount so-called lesser forms of it because we can say, oh, well, the real racists are these neo-Nazis. We need to deal with that first and kind of dismiss everything else when that's not necessarily accurate. And there have been some cases, too, where, again, I've directly observed if we label people one thing that they are not, they say, well, why should I continue my cooperation with you as an academic or with you as a member of law enforcement? I'm just going to go do my own thing and not even try to let you have a visibility into my group anymore. And I hope it's obvious why that has its own set of problems.
So then who are these other folks? Well, according to Amy, they're pretty far from what we think. In fact, some of them aren't even conservative, exactly.
Before Trump, most of them said that they would vote for that third-party candidate because that was closest to their true interest. And then Trump came along and maybe represented that, supposedly, a little bit more clearly. I was actually sworn to secrecy by two of my interviewees, not to tell their compatriots, that they had voted for Obama and even Hillary in one case, because that would just be completely detrimental to their image in the group.
They're also not just living out in the sticks.
Militias can be found, as far as we know right now, in all 50 states, but most of them are not necessarily that sort of stereotypical rural character. In most cases that I have seen, it's almost a reaction to people not living in a rural environment themselves, or at least not being in that environment as much as they would like. You work a city job, you sit at a desk all day, that doesn't fit that traditional notion of masculinity. So maybe you go out to the woods the next weekend and target shoot with your friends, or maybe you even hunt, or maybe you camp out in miserable conditions because somehow that makes you feel closer to nature and feel like you're doing more of what you're supposed to do.
It occurred to me that this same kind of back to nature movement exists on the left. It just might include a lot less guns and a lot more urban farming. The thing is, most militia members probably wouldn't catch your eye.
Most of these people, most of them, if you just met them on the street, you wouldn't necessarily think, oh, militia member, they have jobs, they have families, they're just normal people, except for this very serious and intense hobby.
An intense hobby that is unquestionably rooted in guns.
Guns up. The more the government keeps telling us that we can't have these weapons, the more people want them.
We can see that there is more need than ever to stay strapped or get clapped.
These are not firm boundaries all the time, but in general, militia members really prioritize the Second Amendment, practice with firearms, really respecting what a firearm symbolizes to American culture. Because in their words, and they borrow this from the NRA, without the Second Amendment, we would have no other rights, right? Because they genuinely believe that the U.S. government is a constant risk of being a tyrannical force. And that's very much embedded in the mythos of who we are in terms of how we tell ourselves, at least, America came to be as a country. So it's not really that surprising. They've just always been a little bit more loud and comfortable being loud about claiming some of that identity than some other folks in the conservative spectrum.
And by loud, we do mean loud. But not just in the case of tyranny.
They see themselves as genuinely being the potential last line of defense for a variety of problems in the country. They see themselves as, for the most part, being prepared to help their community in the case of a natural disaster or something much more mundane than a hypothetical foreign invasion or even our own government invasion. But many of them believe that the mere fact that they're out there, they're visible, successfully reminds some government actors that Americans care about these issues, and that alone keeps them in check. The vast majority of them, most of the constitutionalist groups in particular, don't want to have a conflict with the government or really any other entity, but they say they're prepared if the government itself becomes the enemy in those circumstances.
Personally, I've always found this part of the argument kind of hard to relate to. Not just that the government has tanks and drones, and I, in this scenario, have, a basement full of guns, but also the idea that the government, as it were, really cares a lick about what I do unless I break the law. But when militias talk about a conflict with government, there are a few real-world stories that have become something like lore. And one of those is Ruby Ridge.
Now, if you thought that the ATF killing innocent civilians and children was a one-time thing, I'm here to set the record straight.
Tell people if they don't know what Ruby Ridge was.
Ruby Ridge to this day is incredibly controversial, and rightfully so.
The standoff took place at the homestead of Randy and Vicki Weaver, who lived on a secluded plot of land in Idaho with their son, 3 daughters, and a family friend named Kevin Harris. Randy was a military veteran with a tendency toward racism and conspiracies. And on the rare occasion that the family left their home, it was to attend the Aryan Nations World Congress, about 60 miles away. The Weavers never actually joined the group. Randy said he wasn't a joiner. And they said they just liked the way that the Aryan Nation advocated living outside of mainstream society. Nonetheless, this activity caught the attention of the local and federal authorities. And the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, the ATF, eventually asked Randy to work with them as an informant. He refused. Remember, he's not a joiner. And 7 months later, Randy was charged with selling 2 sawed-off shotguns to an undercover agent. It's a long story. Some folks still argue was a setup. But when Randy failed to appear in court, the U.S. Marshals chose to set up regular surveillance of his heavily armed property rather than carry through with a warrant put out for his arrest. The exact sequence of events at Ruby Ridge in August of 1992 are disputed, but some details are clear.
Seems to me like we've got a situation where we know now that the rules of engagement were not right, were not proper, were not constitutional.
That's Senator Fred Thompson, a Republican, in the Senate hearing that followed in 1995.
You're presented with these rules of engagement. You're not supposed to be practicing lawyers. You're not supposed to carry around the Constitution in your pocket. You're told what to do by your superiors. Your superiors give you these instructions. And I would encourage you, you can say that you disagree with them, or yes, they were there and we chose not to follow them, or whatever. But we've heard a lot of different, complex, convoluted testimony, but you're all trying to avoid the clear truth that you were told that anybody outside that cabin with a weapon was fair game, and you were encouraged to shoot them.
The Weaver's 14-year-old son, Sammy, and his dog, Stryker, were shot in the back. And his mother, Vicki, was killed by a stray bullet while holding her 10-month-old daughter. 10 days after the first shots were fired, an injured Randy Weaver and family friend Kevin Harris surrendered. In the end, Randy was only convicted of one thing: failure to appear in court.
The Weaver family surviving members filed a wrongful death case for the death of Sammy and Vicki. Randy Weaver received a $100,000 settlement. His 3 children each received $1 million in 1995.
The Weavers' tragedy captured the nation's attention. It also served as a rallying cry for white supremacists and militias around the U.S., especially when 6 months later, some of the same bureaus and people were involved in another famous standoff.
911, what's your emergency?
There's 75 men around our building and they're shooting at us in Mount Carmel. Tell them there are children and women in here and to call it off.
A 51-day siege by U.S. law enforcement with deadly gun battles, terror from the air, and a raging inferno that left more than 75 people dead, including many women and children.
The tragedy in Waco in 1993 continues to smolder. There are still revelations and why this story still haunts the American people.
The events were cited by Timothy McVeigh as reasons for his bombing of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City on the second anniversary of the second Waco raid. But as it turns out, Oklahoma City didn't help the militia movement's cause.
People got frightened then because the media picked up on it and ran with the militia connection.
That's the founder of the Michigan Militia and self-proclaimed founding father of the militia movement itself, Norm Olson, talking to Vice in 2012.
To the extent that the militia, a third of the militia ran and hid. A third of them went underground, didn't want to be seen, didn't want to be on a list, didn't want to be photographed. Another third just quit the militia altogether. They realized, this wasn't paintball in the woods on the weekend. This was life and death stuff. And another third became more aggressive, more animate about standing up against the government because we saw the conspiracy against it, against what was happening.
And it's that more aggressive third that's growing today.
It's always impossible to get a perfectly accurate count of these groups or these members for a whole host of reasons, including the fact that there's a lot of infighting and competition over who's really in charge over a particular group.
Amy says we know that the movement as a whole isn't quite as large as during the Trump years. It shrank a lot when social media companies deplatformed the groups, and then again after January 6th. But we also know that the percentage of those more conspiratorial and violence-prone millenarian groups has grown significantly.
It used to be the case back when I started field work that they were probably no more than about 10% of the overall militia movement. Today, it's a little harder to give a perfect estimate for a variety of reasons, but we think it's closer to maybe 25%.
And these groups have begun to find common ground with some other groups with different ideologies.
So especially around the summer of 2020, we saw a variety of militia actors going to protest with actors from neo-Nazi groups, from the Proud Boys, from groups that had traditionally been pretty separate, in a way that was concerning, in a way that led into a lot of blurry divisions between these groups. And that's not entirely disappeared.
But that moment in 2020, it didn't start in 2020. It started with Obama. That's up next. Okay, so one of the answers to what it was about President Obama that grew the militia movement is unquestionably race and the backlash among white supremacists that's been covered widely. But Amy says that when it comes to the militias, who historically have been problematic on race but not outright hostile, the answer to what went wrong is more complicated.
They were more concerned about his perspective on the economy, his perspective on gun control, and a variety of other things that are more associated with Democrats as opposed to racial characteristics.
And inside the militias, there was a real openness to talk through solutions.
And I think, honestly, we missed a cultural moment where there was much more space to have productive conversations. One of the things that stood out to me, for example, a lot of them would really openly talk about how they weren't entirely opposed to gun control, for example, that they saw room for discussion around specific boundaries. But we've become so politicized since then that it's hard to really initiate those conversations. And some of the ability to kind of jump right into those conversations is much harder, even in some longstanding relationships, I think.
Amy says that rather than in the lead up to the election or immediately after Obama took office, the biggest uptick in militia membership that she observed came months after Obama's inauguration, in April of 2009.
In 2009, there was a report released by the Department of Homeland Security that was supposed to talk about how military members, especially those returning from active combat zones, might be susceptible to recruitment by militias or, and the phrasing was, or other extremist groups.
And I was very concerned about the fact that we labeled our returning veterans as possible recruiting persons for terrorism in this country.
Homeland Security Secretary Janet Napolitano tried to clear up the controversy surrounding her department's report regarding the threat potential of domestic right-wing extremist groups.
Here's the important point. The report is not saying that veterans are extremists, far from it. What it is saying is returning veterans are targets of right-wing extremist groups that are trying to recruit those to commit violent acts within the country. We want to do all we can to prevent that.
Many people who were upset interpreted the report as saying that veterans were somehow prone to extremism and that they should be treated like suspected terrorists. Veterans were offended, and civilians were offended on their behalf.
We saw major upticks in militia participation for a while after that. I personally, still in the field, saw folks coming back very recently from their service, attending militia meetings for the first time, talking about that report and saying, for the first time, I feel like maybe I need to be prepared to stand up to the government. And of course, it's not new to think about the government as a potential negative force within the militia movement, but it kind of modernized it for them. It was in some ways verbally compared to what had happened at Ruby Ridge in the 90s.
Fast forward to 2015.
Our enemies are getting stronger and stronger by the day, and we as a country are getting weaker.
When Trump announced his presidential bid in June 2015, his opening campaign speech spoke to many of the nostalgic pillars that militia groups believe in.
Fully support and back up the Second Amendment. Nobody will be pushing us around.
Gun sales reached a record high, and militia numbers exploded. Then, COVID happened.
We saw a lot of people quickly become convinced that Black Lives Matter was actually being run by Antifa, which was maybe Russia, and somehow that was going to spread to every neighborhood in the country and be really harmful to everyone, and so they needed to stop that process.
And that brought folks together. Folks like militias and the neo-Nazis they used to hate.
Those were the moments that those conversations happened and the ability to sort of perceive commonalities came to the fore.
Commonalities like accelerationism.
The Tennessee man is facing federal charges after authorities say he tried to destroy an energy facility in Nashville.
Allegedly believed that a destabilizing terrorist attack on the nation's energy sector could incite unrest and help spark a civil war.
Accelerationism is this idea that modern society is facing an inevitable and escalating decline. And some more militant accelerationists believe that they should hurry that decline along in order to ultimately establish a new social order. This is where things start to look really dangerous, like folks rooting for a civil war dangerous. Amy says that she's concerned that, intentioned or no, in the days and years to come, Trump's words could be taken as a call to action, much like his stand back and stand by comment to the Proud Boys in 2020.
I don't think we're talking about the majority of the movement here, but there are certain people, certain groups within it who are now positioned to hear, even if they're not explicit, hear unofficial orders, especially I think about the border, especially about migrants. A lot of what Trump says about protecting the border and you know, they're not sending us their best people, all of that rhetoric, it's not just racism or xenophobia, but it's a reminder to folks who really believe migrants are a problem that maybe they should be empowered to do something about it, especially if they're in those areas.
So I asked Amy, what do we do?
So we live in a world of limited resources, right? And I think that practically speaking, from a law enforcement perspective, we certainly need to be focusing more on the groups that are on the millenarian end of the spectrum. Those that are overtly conspiratorial, those that include either religion or racism as a part of their group identity. So the group, the unit itself kind of cosigns onto some overtly religious or racist principle. In my experience, those things have been pretty highly correlated with plots and or actual violence coming out of some of these groups. However, we do have to understand, just like we saw in 2020, that there is a potential under the right circumstances, under the right narratives, for folks not just in the constitutionalist groups, but for folks completely outside of the militia movement, people we would describe as normal people who aren't belonging to any group, being radicalized on a very similar sort of pathway.
And has the government response so far, I know that there were some new moves within the Biden administration, has that been adequate?
TBD, I think, on that. I think that maybe perhaps especially in border areas, local sheriffs, local police underestimate the potential for radicalization in some of these spaces, because it's not uncommon in some of these towns for police to grow up with these folks or go to school with them or be related to them and say, oh, well, we're on the same side. There's not really a danger here.
This is where Amy sees the greatest potential for change, regardless of what might come out of the White House. She says that training law enforcement at the local and federal level to identify potential threats, understand harms, and nurture more mutually beneficial relationships could go a long way to help rebuild what we've lost.
I saw some cases, especially during my field work, where, for example, there were a couple militia members who would regularly talk to law enforcement, both local and the FBI, and just kind of say, hey, this is what we're doing, or hey, I heard this about a different group. You might want to just be aware of it, or maybe even check into it. And there's no trust there now for most of these groups to have that kind of conversation. And some of that was a direct response to the broader political environment. Some of it was because of overly aggressive actions on the part of some of those law enforcement contacts, just kind of as a show of power. That doesn't work well in a group that's kind of fundamentally about masculinity and reclaiming masculinity. So I think that law enforcement in particular needs to have a better understanding of how to engage with these groups. We need to make sure law enforcement are adequately and accurately trained to understand a variety of threats and also how to adequately and accurately engage with people from a variety of perspectives without unnecessarily escalating a situation.
It's a strategy that applies to the militia movement as a whole.
There's actually this sociology term. It comes from a fundamental theorist named Max Weber, and it's a German word whose pronunciation I may not ever get exactly perfect, but my understanding is pronounced verstehen. And within the field of sociology, basically that equates to putting yourself into somebody else's shoes, understanding the world from their perspective. And that doesn't mean that you agree with them necessarily or think everything that they're doing is exactly correct. But instead, you're interpreting what they believe. You're interpreting their actions through their worldview and their experiences. Because if we don't do that, if we don't actually understand why people come to do or believe certain things, no matter what it is, then we can't really engage with that in either a positive way or a way that might theoretically break down, some conspiracism or false beliefs or even animosity toward other groups.
Amy says that it's hard to tell what's coming, that militias, like a lot of us, are responsive to news cycles. So when the border is in the news, they're more focused on the border. But that kind of thing can turn on a dime. Maybe the best thing that we can do now is just try to have a little more empathy.
Again, some of them are bad people, but the most of them are just normal people who care a lot about the country, who go to their job every day and come home and take care of their family and really worry about their family's future. And when we demonize all of them and miss all of that, it's just not helpful to any sort of positive outcome.
Next time on Things That Go Boom, we talk about pardons.
The people that are sitting in jail are not 70-year-old grandmas. They're not hostages. The people that are sitting in jail are the people who violently assaulted police officers with their fists, with flagpoles, with the batons they stole from police, with the stun gun that they drove in Michael Fanone's neck.
Things That Go Boom is distributed by Inkstick Media and PRX. Before we go on, I just want to issue a little bit of a correction. We said that negotiation led to peace in Sri Lanka in 2002 on our last episode. It was a little bit of a throwaway line, and it was a little bit unfair to the story, which is a lot more complicated than that. We want to encourage you to look into that story yourself and not take our word for it that it really ended in 2002. This episode was produced by me and assembled by Nikki Galtland. Our music is composed by Darian Schulman, and Robin Wise makes our show sound its very best. Thank you to our supporters, the Carnegie Corporation of New York and Plowshares Fund, as well as the Colomb Foundation, Craig Newmark Philanthropies, Prospect Hill Foundation, and the Jubitz Family Foundation. We'll see you right back here in 2 weeks for our next episode. All right, so we'll watch the news.
Yeah.
As if we weren't all stressed out enough.